It is fascinating to me that a company cemented itself in American lore by hunting outlaws, guarding trains, and breaking strikes. They may not have been the villains, but I wouldn't say they were the good guys. I learned about the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I would think that chances are better than not that you've probably heard of the Pinkerton Detective Agency at some point in your life. They've been portrayed in books, movies, and video games. For those of us who played Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2, we will never forgive them for what they did. They're such a mythological part of American lore that I could understand if some people thought they were just a creation of great writers. Fiction. Well, they're real, and they still exist. They no longer go by detective agency, now they're simply Pinkerton. They mostly focus on security and risk management. I'm not here to talk about what they do now. I don't know anything about it. Haven't followed up on them, so I can't speak to the present. I'm going to focus on their beginnings in the 1860s and their wild ride from hunting outlaws to strike breaking, and then what led them to transition into a security company. The Pinkertons were the brainchild of Alan Pinkerton. A lot of modesty there, named the company after himself. Pinkerton was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1819. In his 20s, he participated in the Chartism movement. Chartists demanded political reform. They had respectable goals, but they weren't peaceful about trying to achieve them. They got violent. To be fair, I don't know enough about the movement to tell you the rights and wrongs of it and how accurate the assessments I read were. I don't know enough about the Chartists. I do want to study Chartists more, but if I allowed myself to go down every historical tangent I find myself on during research, I'd never release an episode. What I can tell you is they were disliked by authorities. If you were part of their movement, you had a chance of becoming a wanted man. Pinkerton was no exception, and a warrant was put out for his arrest. Pinkerton fled from Scotland to Chicago in 1842. He stopped in Canada first, but I guess he didn't like maple syrup. Life would be different if there wasn't such a strange twist of fate for Alan Pinkerton. He was out one day looking for wood on an island on the Fox River. Now, I don't know if he ever found the wood he was looking for, but I do know what he found was a counterfeiter's camp. So, being the good little boy that he was, he ran back, grabbed the local sheriff, and claimed the reward. Honestly, it's like hitting the lottery. You were looking for something else, and you found counterfeiters. That's pretty ridiculous to me. I would never expect something like that to happen. I've never found a counterfeiter camp by accident, or on purpose. Most people, normal people, might receive the reward and think, what a stroke of luck. But that's it. I got lucky, found some counterfeiters. I'm going to go back to doing whatever I do. But not Alan Pinkerton. Pinkerton put himself out there as someone who could solve crimes, fight back against the counterfeiters. And soon he was receiving calls from businessmen asking for help. So he got himself some friends, a van, and a dog, and he hunted mystery counterfeiters for years. Well, no, not really. Instead, for the next several years, Pinkerton would find himself in various law enforcement jobs. He was a sheriff's deputy, and at one point, he was even a special agent for the U.S. Postal Service. Wonder how he got that job. While serving in these positions, he began taking on security contracts for local railroad companies. Local rail lines would hire Pinkerton to oversee security and its employees. I get it. Trains were the main mode of transportation for a lot of goods. Train robberies are so well known because they were very popular and a good way of making some money. I understand hiring private security. Modest as he was, Pinkerton realized that he couldn't do it all on his own, and as a result, he formed the Northwest Police Agency. I guess he wasn't quite confident enough to put his name on it yet. However, his work guarding the rails led him to investigate a theft from the Adams Express Company. Pinkerton found the perpetrator and the stolen money. Why does this even matter? Because this was a big case for Pinkerton. Pinkerton was about to hang his hat on this case when he was looking for jobs. Truthfully, it must have given him confidence. He changed the company's name to Pinkerton's National Police Agency. There's that branding. I bet you're sitting there and saying to yourself, okay, you found some counterfeiters, found some train robbers, but how does this agency become the Pinkertons? How does that name spread? How does it become as famous as it does? Well, he allegedly foiled the assassination plot of the soon-to-be president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. President-elect Lincoln was having dinner with the Pennsylvania governor in Harrisburg, and he was scheduled to take a train to Philadelphia and then down to Washington on February 21st, 1861. Lincoln's train had one stop in Baltimore on the way. Samuel Felton, who was involved with the rail line on which Lincoln would be traveling, hired Alan Pinkerton to investigate any potential issues. If you heard my Death by Lightning review, you would know that presidents in the 19th century were fairly exposed. At this point, there isn't even Secret Service. They just did not watch out for people. It really is wild to read how easy it was for people to get to the president. Wasn't that much work. Pinkerton put his best man, Timothy Webster, on the case. Webster learned that at the Baltimore stop, pro-secession assassins would strike at Lincoln. I butchered saying that a few times. Naturally, Pinkerton rushed to save Lincoln. He advised the president to leave Harrisburg early and secretly, then rush to Philly, which led him to get to Baltimore and Washington as quickly as possible. Basically, Pinkerton wanted Lincoln to speed up his plans to throw off the potential assassins. Lincoln was initially dubious, but he acquiesced once a second report arrived from a New York detective hired by Lincoln's cabinet. Scholars debate whether there was an actual assassination plot. Listen, I'm learning about this and reiterating what I learned. This is all new to me. I don't know. Would it shock me that someone like Pinkerton made it up? No. But there was that extra source, and assassination plots against Lincoln are not shocking at all. I also know that Lincoln didn't actually believe Pinkerton, or at least listen to him, because he changed his schedule. In fact, the New York Times reported on Lincoln changing his schedule and acknowledged the proposed assassination plots. Obviously, they reported it after the fact. It would have been weird to report it before, and dangerous. Response was mixed to Lincoln's change of plans. Some people mocked him, including a political cartoonist, for being afraid. It's easy for the cartoonist. He's not going to get hunted. He's not going to have assassins after him. And hey, as the future tells us, they had every right to be concerned about Lincoln and assassins. Pinkerton's time helping the Union wouldn't be over after saving Lincoln. Pinkerton became the head spy for General George McClellan. At this point, McClellan was leading the Union Army and needed spies to help him understand the Confederate movements. When I was reading and researching about this, what I found fascinating is that the historical consensus is that Pinkerton did an awful job as chief spy. Historians said that he overestimated Confederate strength and was at least partially responsible for McClellan's hesitation to chase after the Confederate army. There are some historians and people that disagree. Author J. Bonansinga believes that Pinkerton provided accurate information on, and McClellan had it separately verified by other sources. Bonansinga puts the blame solely on McClellan. I'm sorry, Jay, if I messed up your last name. I don't know. It's a tough call, and you have historians disagreeing. I think that's how muddy the situation is. And some people are just trying to figure out what the heck was going on with McClellan. But really, it didn't matter, because in the end, Pinkerton's fate was tied to McClellan. So once McClellan was out, Pinkerton was out. And a little tidbit of an interesting fact, Timothy Webster, the Pinkerton agent who helped uncover the possible Lincoln assassination plot, was captured and hanged by the Confederates for being a spy. That's a sad end. He was just trying to serve the Union. The Civil War ends. You know that. And Pinkerton turns his attention to his detective agency. His men continued to work for the railroad companies that he had contracts with, and they protected them from robbery and theft. He was good at that, I believe. But Pinkerton got a taste for hunting down bank robbers and other outlaws. They had a very successful investigation into a criminal group like the Reno Gang, a bunch of train robbers out of Indiana. But for as successful as they were hunting down the Reno Gang, I think they gained a lot of notoriety for their failed investigation and hunt for the James Younger Gang. If you hear me talk about Jesse James in my episode about him, you would understand that this gang, they weren't good people. They were former Confederate guerrillas. They wanted revenge on the Union. They had no hesitation about killing. Most importantly, they were greedy and they wanted the money all for themselves. They were the definition of outlaw criminals. From what I've learned, Pinkerton had dollar signs in his eyes when he looked at them. He probably thought this was a good way to make his company's name even bigger. So first, he sent one of his agents, Joseph Witcher, to infiltrate the gang. And authorities later found his corpse. This wasn't the end of the Pinkertons chasing the James Younger gang. On January 25th, 1875, the Pinkertons surrounded the home of Jesse and Frank James. There's no way they were in a good mood, having just lost a colleague, and there's no doubt it made the entire thing worse. The agents threw a device in the house meant to illuminate the inside, but it was highly flammable. The occupants of the house didn't know that, and they threw the device into the fire, which led to an explosion. The explosion killed Jesse and Frank's 8-year-old half-brother, Samuel, and also tore the arm off a second occupant. Neither Jesse nor his brother were home. The public wasn't happy. There's no way to spin this as anything other than a bad situation. Their actions led to the death of a child. They didn't even get the outlaws. But apparently, the Pinkertons didn't really see any repercussions, at least legally. Probably didn't hurt them if there was some local law enforcement with the Pinkertons that night. However, I will say everything I read made it seem like the Pinkertons took the lead. I questioned this in my James episode, and I question it now. I don't know why they would hire the Pinkertons for that. That just seems like a disaster waiting to happen. But again, the Pinkertons got away scot-free. And if you're wondering, why couldn't they spin this event in a way to benefit themselves? Yes, they killed a child, but it's their word against Jesse and Frank. I mean, these are the dastardly villains. Not possible. Because if you listen to me talk about Jesse James, you know that he had a great publicist. It would make them as outright villainous as the game makes them seem. I think that the way they are portrayed in the game has to do with the stories begun by Edwards when he defended Jesse James. I'm not an expert, but that just makes sense to me. The way it lines up is too clean. Finally, it's important to note that the Pinkertons were not successful in hunting down the James Younger gang. Good job, guys. Years later, Pinkertons once again tried to chase down their Western side of glory when they went after Butch Cassidy at the turn of the 20th century. This was about 25 years later. They had an agent, Charles Siringo, who infiltrated the gang, which is pretty impressive. The Pinkertons only played a tertiary role in capturing no. Years later, the Pinkertons once again tried to chase down their Western style glory when they went after Butch Cassidy at the turn of the 20th century. This was about 25 years later. They had an agent, Charles Siringo, who infiltrated the gang, which is pretty impressive. But in the end, the Pinkertons only played a tertiary role in capturing Cassidy's gang, and they never caught Butcher Sundance. I don't know if they had just stayed hunting outlaws and bank robbers, would the Pinkertons have had a better reputation by now? Years later, the Pinkertons once again tried to chase down their Western style glory when they went after Butch Cassidy at the turn of the 20th century. This was about 25 years later. They had an agent, Charles Siringo, who infiltrated the gang, which is pretty impressive. But in the end, the Pinkertons only played a tertiary role in capturing Cassidy's gang, and they never caught Butcher Sundance. I don't know if they had just stayed hunting outlaws and bank robbers, would the Pinkertons have had a better reputation by now? I know they were made the villains in the Jesse James story, but the way the world works, they could have almost started to be idolized at that point as part of the Old West legend. But they didn't stay with just that line of work. They decided to start working for companies to stop strikes. I'm sure you know that during the late 19th, early 20th centuries, strikes were gaining popularity. People started demanding better working conditions, better lives. Businesses obviously had no intention of making that happen, so they hired the Pinkertons to stop these strikes. One story has the Pinkertons infiltrating a secret society known as the Molly Maguires between 1873 and 1876. The Maguires were immigrants from Ireland who had a reputation for violence. They responded violently to the abuses suffered by workers while employed in Philadelphia and for the Reading Railroad. Again, I'm not saying their cause was wrong, but violence doesn't usually help. Eventually, 29 miners were accused of being Maguires, and they were arrested and charged with a litany of crimes, including murder. They were convicted and executed, due in large part to testimony from a Pinkerton detective. But the crazy thing I read when learning about this was that the prosecution couldn't even prove the Molly Maguires existed. Now I have a feeling it's very similar to like when prosecutors were trying to prove the mob existed and they couldn't. Clearly it did. It's just, how do you prove that these guys are all part of it? And if you can't prove the gang exists or the group exists, that's a fairly interesting point. How can you convict someone when you can't even say the organization they belong to exists? It's wild. Alan Pinkerton died at the age of 64 on July 1st, 1884. So he did have time to see his detective agency grow. His sons naturally took over the family business, and they continued to work defending the industrialist. Chicago had a bunch of strikes in 1886, and they experienced two separate violent incidents that resulted in deaths. The first one was where the police fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 4. And then, at the next rally at Haymarket Square, protesters retaliated by throwing handmade bombs that killed 7 police officers. Police arrested 8 men, charged them with murder, and called them anarchists. Again, testimony from a Pinkerton detective was one of the critical pieces of information needed for convicting the defendants. However, in June of 1893, the governor of Illinois, John Altgeld, reviewed the trials and concluded that the evidence was contradictory and poor. He actually issued pardons for those convicted, but sadly, 4 had already been executed. So now, this highlight moment, this great moment, these convictions, this moment of glory for the Pinkertons, it's now one of shame, one where they did wrong. There are many stories where the Pinkertons take the role of private police force for business owners, industrialists. There's one where the Pinkertons arrived by a barge to guard a mill, hiring scab workers in Pennsylvania. They were going to guard the mill and the scab workers. The barge was spotted and came under fire by striking employees. The Pinkertons surrendered. So the striking workers took the Pinkerton detectives into custody. Now I'm laughing, but that's kind of embarrassing. You're a big bad detective agency, and you surrendered as you were on your way in to be guards. Real tough guys. Former Pinkerton detective Charles Siringo wrote his memoir about his investigation into a mining strike. It's a fascinating memoir that I encourage you to read. I don't encourage you to read all my sources, but his book is a lot of fun. The tale involves a narrow escape as the miners discover he's undercover. He's hiding under the floorboards of a house as the miners search for him. He can hear them walking, but they don't find him. I don't know if this is true or not, but it's a fun story. The interesting thing is, Stringo became unhappy with the Pinkerton Detective Agency after he retired, mainly because he wanted to publish his memoirs and the Pinkertons didn't like it. He had enough stuff in the books that made them look not good. His methodology was questionable, so they stopped the publishing of his memoirs until they forced him to change the name to the Dickerson Detective Agency. I feel like we're in a TV show where they can't say Burger King, so it's like Hamburger Queen or something. That just makes me laugh. He did later publish the book, where he spoke out about the Pinkertons and their work on behalf of the businesses and industrialists. But I need to point out that you can't really ignore the fact that Serengo really only got angry at them after they wouldn't let his memoir be published. They hurt him monetarily. That's when he cared. The agency's work for these businesses was giving them a bad name. Congress felt the need to intervene, and on March 3rd, 1893, they passed the Anti-Pinkerton Act. This act severely limited the federal government's ability to hire private firms like the Pinkertons. As I said earlier, the agency did try to recapture some of its glory when it went hunting for Butch Cassidy, but the only real notable thing is that Serengo infiltrated the gang, and that's kind of cool. The 20th century saw the Pinkertons continue to take place in strike breaking until eventually they shifted their business practices to personal security risk assessment and things of that nature. It is the type of business they continue to do to this day. They were purchased by Securitas AB in 1999, but they are still around and their main focus remains security. I found this fascinating, this whole topic. I loved researching and learning about the Pinkertons. They're an interesting group. Again, they're part of American lore, part of American mythology. And that's some of the history I find most fascinating, the stuff that becomes almost mythological in our minds. If anyone listening to this enjoyed learning about the Pinkertons, if you're a fan of Red Dead Redemption, you learned a little about the villain of the story. Maybe you were hoping for more outlaw stories, but the truth is their primary role in most outlaw hunts was providing information. If it wasn't for their misadventures and poor actions in the Jesse James hunt, I don't know if you would even remember them for their role in chasing outlaws. They definitely weren't what Red Dead Redemption makes them out to be. They were a private police force for private businesses. That was their main role. And that is where they made their bones, so to say. So that is the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was a fun topic, kind of ties into some of the other stuff I've done. Please like, subscribe, comment, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you next time.